I never thought I'd find myself working in a place like this. If you told me a year ago that I'd be spending my nights alone with paintings older than most countries, I would have laughed at you. But desperation makes you consider things you'd never imagine. Rent was eating me alive, and after my last job dissolved overnight, I was desperate for steady work. That's how I stumbled on the listing. It was buried online, not on any major job board, more like something that slipped through the cracks. Art restoration assistant needed, no experience required, training provided, discretion expected. That was it. No company logo, no contact name, just a number to call. It sounded suspicious, but the pay was listed at nearly double what I was making before, more than enough to cover my bills and still leave me breathing. So I called. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and strangely old-fashioned. They asked me almost nothing about my skills, just whether I could work nights, whether I was good at following instructions, and whether I'd ever spoken publicly about my jobs before. I said yes, and no. That seemed to be enough. Within minutes, I was scheduled for orientation. The building wasn't in the city. It sat outside the main roads, past neighborhoods I didn't know existed, tucked behind a line of withered trees. The structure looked like a museum that had been forgotten by time. 3 stories of stone in shadow. Its windows too dark to reflect anything but your own outline. When I walked through the front doors, the first thing that struck me wasn't the architecture. It was the silence. The air felt preserved, like the sound had been drained out decades ago and never returned. My footsteps echoed in ways they shouldn't have, like the walls were bending the noise back toward me. The man waiting for me in the lobby introduced himself as Mr. Harrow, thin, pale, with a voice that carried without effort, as though the building belonged to him on a level deeper than ownership. He didn't shake my hand, only studied me as if I were another artifact to catalog. He led me down a corridor lined with covered frames. Even beneath the dust cloths, I felt them. The paintings. My eyes kept flicking back, certain that one of them would move. Of course, they didn't. Not yet. Harrow spoke of the collection in measured tones, though he never explained where the paintings had come from. Private donors, he said. Old families, that was all. But there was weight in his words. A suggestion that he knew far more than he wanted me to. I told myself it was just nerves. First nights always feel heavier than they are. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that each step deeper into the building was taking me somewhere I shouldn't go. The restoration room was on the 2nd floor, tucked in the back wing, where natural light couldn't reach. Rows of canvases leaned against the walls, their faces turned inward, as if in shame. Others hung uncovered, and though the brushstrokes were cracked and faded, the eye seemed wet, alive. Watching, I brushed it off as imagination, a trick of dim light. Long hours of anxiety. But when Harrow left me alone for the first time, I turned toward the largest canvas in the room. It was a portrait, tall, elegant, the figure dressed in clothing centuries old. The expression was .com/detached. I blinked, and in that instant, I could swear the corners of its mouth had lifted, not into a smile. Not quite. Something worse, a smirk, as if it already knew me. Mr. Harrow didn't explain the smile. He didn't even seem to notice the shift I thought I'd seen. Instead, he guided me around the room, pointing out tools of restoration, solvents, brushes, lamps with bulbs as bright as miniature suns. He spoke with rehearsed precision, like someone repeating lines that had to be memorized exactly. At last, he stopped beside a heavy oak table, set with a single folder. "This," he said, sliding it toward me, "is the orientation packet. You'll find the rules inside." The word caught my attention. Rules. I expected something simple: guidelines about handling fragile material, warnings against food and drink, but his tone was too deliberate, too careful. I opened the folder. There were 7 rules typed in neat black ink, each numbered, each ending with a period as though final. I read them once, then again. My throat felt dry. The rules: Rule 1. Never work with the lights off. If a bulb burns out, replace it immediately, no matter the hour. Rule 2. Do not uncover more than one painting at a time. Cover the last before you reveal another. Rule 3. If you feel a draft in the room, do not acknowledge it. Continue your work as though nothing has changed. Rule 4. Never describe a painting out loud. Not to yourself, not to anyone else, not even in jest. Rule 5. If a figure in the artwork appears different than it did before, do not react. Record the change silently in the logbook. Then continue working. Rule 6. Under no circumstances should you touch the surface of the paintings with your bare skin. Gloves are provided. Replace them if they tear. Rule 7. At midnight, you must leave the restoration room. Lock the door behind you. If you hear knocking from inside after that point, ignore it. I looked up from the page, waiting for him to smirk, to tell me it was some old ritual, a leftover from eccentric curators. But his face was steady, his expression unreadable. You're serious, I said quietly. These rules are not suggestions, Harrow replied. His eyes did not leave mine. They are the reason you will survive here. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. He wasn't threatening me. He was warning me. I wanted to ask why such strange restrictions existed, why anyone would frame them with the gravity of commandments. But the words lodged in my throat. Something about his gaze told me the explanation wouldn't come now, maybe not ever. Instead, I nodded. I understand. Harrow tapped the folder. You'll memorize them quickly. Break one, and consequences will follow. Not from me, from them. His hand gestured toward the covered paintings. The cloth draped over the canvases stirred, just slightly, as though touched by a breeze. Yet the air around us was still. Now, Harrow said briskly, pulling the cloth tighter. Your shift begins at 9 each evening. You'll have 6 hours to work. Everything you need is in this room. Do not wander the other halls. You are not cleared for them. I couldn't help myself. What happens if I? You won't. His voice cut clean across mine. Then, softer. Curiosity is a liability. Here, contain it. He closed the folder, as if sealing the rules back inside. Then he checked his watch. You'll have the room to yourself tonight. I'll return at closing. Until then, trust the instructions. Follow them. And, should you ever doubt, read them again. He left me with those words, the echo of his steps fading into the hollow corridors. Alone, again. I pulled the folder back open and stared at the rules. The paper looked older than I'd first noticed, yellowed at the edges. The ink faintly smudged as though handled too many times. It struck me that Harrow hadn't said who wrote them, or how long they'd been used. I told myself they were precautions. Maybe the paintings were chemically unstable. Maybe drafts carried dust. Maybe the lights protected fragile pigment. It all had logical explanations, until I got to Rule 7. The words twisted in my mind. If you hear knocking from inside after midnight, ignore it. Ignore. It. The thought that something inside the paintings might be capable of sound left me cold. Still, I stayed. Because I needed the job. Because the money was too good. Because, in the end, I convinced myself rules were harmless if I treated them as tradition. But even as I prepared my first set of tools, I felt their eyes on me. Beneath every cloth, behind every cracked layer of paint. Something was watching. And when the clock struck 9, the silence of the building pressed heavier than ever. It felt less like starting a shift, and more like stepping into a contract. The first 2 hours passed slowly. I kept the lights blazing, the tools neatly arranged, the folder of rules sitting on the corner of the desk, like a silent overseer. I chose a smaller canvas to begin with, one that seemed less threatening. It was a still life, a bowl of fruit. The colors faded into sepia by time. My task was simple. Remove surface dust, apply a light cleaning solution, and document the condition. At first it was peaceful. The rhythm of the brush strokes calmed my nerves, and I almost convinced myself the rules were nothing more than superstition. But then, just past 10 o'clock, a bulb above me flickered. I froze, brush hovering above the canvas. It was only for an instant, just a quick dimming of light before it flared back to normal. But the silence that followed was wrong. It felt as though the air itself was holding its breath. I remembered Rule 1, never work with the lights off. If a bulb burns out, replace it immediately, no matter the hour. The bulb wasn't burned out. Not yet, but my mind gnawed at the what if. What if it went dark while I was standing here with my gloves on, my eyes focused too closely on the canvas? What would happen in that split second of shadow? I shook the thought away. Superstition, I told myself. Just nerves. Still, I kept glancing at the bulb every few minutes, half expecting it to die. And that was when I broke a rule. It wasn't intentional. I'd been working so carefully on the fruit canvas that when I leaned back, my elbow brushed against the edge of another cloth-draped frame behind me. The fabric slipped before I could catch it. The second painting was suddenly exposed. I cursed under my breath. Rule 2. Do not uncover more than one painting at a time. I turned quickly, intending to drape the cloth back into place before Harrow ever found out. But the moment my eyes landed on the second painting, I froze. It was a portrait of a man, his face pale, his eyes heavy-lidded, as though caught between sleep and waking. The detail was sharper than the fruit still life, as though the paint hadn't aged at all, and his gaze wasn't fixed forward, like most portraits. It was tilted slightly directly at me. I pulled the cloth back over it, my hands trembling. Then I looked at the fruit still life again. The bowl was no longer full. 3 of the apples were missing. The brush slipped from my glove. My chest tightened, my throat refusing to swallow. I blinked once, twice. The missing fruit didn't return. The bowl sat half empty, its edges smeared faintly with what looked like juice stains. I forced myself to breathe. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. If a figure in the artwork appears different than it did before, do not react. Record the change silently in the logbook, then continue working. But this wasn't a figure. It was an object. Did the rule apply? My instincts screamed to document it anyway. I fumbled for the logbook, wrote the time and a shaky note. 3 apples, missing from still life. Cloth slip may have triggered change. As soon as I set the pen down, a sound drifted from behind me. A soft, deliberate crunch, like teeth breaking through skin, like a bite taken from something crisp and fresh. My stomach lurched. I spun around, staring at the draped painting of the man. The cloth didn't move. Nothing did. But I could swear there was moisture seeping slowly through the bottom edge of the fabric. A faint red trail crawling down the frame. Juice, or something thicker. The bulb above me flickered again, brighter this time, and held. I didn't wait for more. I shoved the logbook closed, forced myself to keep working on the fruit painting as if nothing had happened. My gloves trembled, my breath uneven. But I remembered Harrow's words, do not react. The rest of the shift stretched like years. No more bulbs flickered, no more cloths slipped, but the air in the room had changed. I could no longer shake the certainty that the paintings were not objects to be repaired. They were participants, and they had noticed me. The next night I arrived early. The memory of the missing apples lingered in my head, vivid, as if I'd eaten them myself. I told myself it had been exhaustion, a slip of perception, but the sound, that wet crunch in the silence, was harder to dismiss. Harrow didn't mention the log entry when he checked me in. He only asked, did you follow the rules? I said yes, and his nod told me he already knew more than I did. When 9 o'clock came, I was alone again in the restoration room. The bulbs glared bright, the folder of rules sat at my elbow, and the fruit still life remained uncovered. I didn't plan to make the same mistake twice. I worked for over an hour without incident, moving carefully, documenting every stroke, every detail. The logbook was filling with neat notes. Then, around 10:30, I felt it. The air shifted, subtle at first, a coolness brushing the hairs on my arms, then stronger, winding across the room like invisible fingers. A draft. Rule 3 returned to me in a heartbeat. If you feel a draft in the room, do not acknowledge it. Continue your work as though nothing has changed. My grip tightened on the brush. I forced my eyes back to the canvas, even as the chill wrapped around my shoulders. It wasn't just a draft. It carried a scent. Damp stone, earth, something like soil disturbed after years of rest. I kept working, movements stiff. My mind screamed to look toward the source, to see if a window had cracked open or if a vent had come loose. But the rules were clear. Do not acknowledge it. The brush dragged shakily across the surface of the canvas. I tried to steady my breathing, but then came the sound, faint at first. Carried on the cold, whispering not words. I could recognize just the cadence of speech. Low, patient, rising and falling in a rhythm older than language. I clenched my teeth. Every instinct screamed to react. My hands shook so violently I nearly tore the canvas with the bristles. The whispering grew closer, not from behind me, but from inside the walls, inside the floor, surrounding the room, as though the draft itself was breathing words against my ears. I dropped the brush. It clattered to the table, loud in the suffocating hush that followed. And that was when I broke. I turned my head just slightly toward the far wall. Nothing, only stone and shadow. But the draft stopped instantly. The air went still, heavy, almost mocking. A single sound answered my disobedience. Tap. It came from within the wall, sharp, precise, like a knuckle against wood. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound didn't repeat. The silence stretched on, thicker than before. I forced myself to sit again, forced myself to pick up the brush, though my gloves were damp with sweat. The rest of the shift, I worked without daring to move my eyes from the canvas. My every breath felt borrowed. When the clock struck midnight, I didn't need reminding. I covered the painting, locked the door, and fled the hall without looking back. Harrow was waiting for me in the lobby. His expression gave nothing away, but his first words chilled me. You turned. I swallowed hard, just for a second. His stare cut deeper than a blade. That is 1 second too many. You felt the draft. You heard them. I nodded, throat too tight to answer. You must never respond, he said. His voice had softened, but the weight in it doubled. That is how they know you can hear them. That is when they begin to speak directly. I wanted to ask who or what he meant, but my tongue felt paralyzed. Harrow leaned closer. You are still alive because you remembered to leave at midnight. Some before you did not. Then he straightened, dismissing me with a simple motion of his hand. Go home, sleep, return tomorrow, and pray you learn restraint before they learn your name. I left the building, but the scent of damp earth clung to me all the way home. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispering draft hadn't stayed behind. It had followed me by the third night. I could no longer pretend the rules were eccentric tradition. The paintings changed. The draft whispered, and Harrow's words about survival echoed in my head long after I left the building. That night, I resolved to look deeper, not into the paintings that was dangerous, but into the place itself. Harrow wasn't present when I arrived, which was unusual. The key was waiting for me on the front desk, along with a folded slip of paper in his angular handwriting. Begin in the restoration room. Do not wander. I pocketed the note and climbed the stairs, but my thoughts were already turning. He hadn't said he would know if I wandered. He had only warned against it, and warnings always had roots. The first 2 hours passed without incident. The bulbs glared steadily, the brushes moved smoothly, and I forced myself to ignore the shiver of eyes beneath every cloth. But when the clock inched toward 11, curiosity ate through restraint. I left the brush on the desk, pocketed the logbook, and slipped into the hallway. The corridors beyond the restoration room were worse than I imagined. Dust coated the floors, thick enough to muffle my steps. The walls bore cracks like veins, and the light bulbs flickered in unpredictable patterns, some dim, some glaring. Every doorway was locked with heavy iron handles except one. The handle turned easily. The door opened without resistance. It was an office, long abandoned. The desk was buried in papers, the drawers left half open. A stale smell hung in the air, like mold mixed with varnish. I pulled open the top drawer. Inside were logbooks, several of them, not the neat, crisp version Harrow had given me, but older, their pages yellowed and frayed. I flipped one open. The handwriting was frantic, uneven. Day 12. Lights flickered. I froze. Mistake. When it came back, she was closer. Another entry. Day 20. Heard voices in the draft. They called my name. How do they know my name? I swallowed hard and turned more pages. Day 31. Harrow says to ignore the knocking. But what if it's not them? What if it's the others? What if someone is trapped inside? The writing ended abruptly halfway down the page. The next logbook belonged to someone else. A different hand, calmer, more deliberate. Day 5. One of the paintings smiled at me. Harrow says, "This is normal." I don't think it's normal. Day 18. A figure stepped out of the frame when the light failed. Only a foot, only for a second, but it left a print. Day 23. He says never to touch them. I saw why, tonight. A brush slipped, my glove tore, my hand burned until morning. The notes grew darker, more erratic. Then they stopped altogether. I dug deeper. Beneath the logbooks were folders of typed reports. Some dated back decades, some even earlier. Names of employees, their start dates. Beside most of the names was a word, deceased. Others read unaccounted. A handful bore the mark transferred. Transferred where? To what? I felt the room tilt around me, my pulse quickening. One folder slipped from the pile, scattering its contents across the floor. I crouched, gathered them, then froze. A photograph lay face up on the dust. It showed the restoration room decades ago, judging by the grain. In the center stood a man in gloves, bent over a canvas, but behind him, in the uncovered paintings, the figures were not still. Their eyes were turned toward him, every single one. I shoved the papers back and forced the drawer shut, my hands shaking. I should have left then. Returned to my post, forgotten what I'd seen, but something in me needed more. Proof. A filing cabinet in the corner caught my eye. Its lock was rusted, broken. Inside were reels of old security footage. Labels scrawled in fading ink. 1973, 1986, 2002. Most were useless without a projector, but one reel wasn't film. It was a VHS tape. I found a dusty player tucked beneath the cabinet, its cord still coiled. Against my better judgment, I plugged it in and pressed play. The screen crackled. Grainy black and white footage appeared. The restoration room. A man worked alone, much like I had. Hours ticked by in silence. Then, around midnight, the man failed to leave. He stayed past the ruled at first. Nothing happened. Then the bulbs began to dim. The man glanced around nervously, checking wires. He laughed at the superstition. That was when the paintings began to move. Not all at once, just the figures at the edges, tilting their heads, their eyes following him. The man didn't notice until one figure stepped down. It slid silently from the frame, its features blurred in the grain, but unmistakably human. The man ran. He pounded at the locked door, screaming, the camera capturing his distorted face in frantic flashes. Behind him, more figures stepped down. One by one, the tape ended there. I ejected it with trembling hands, the machine wheezing like it had exhaled. Something foul. The office suddenly felt too small. The air pressed in, suffocating. I shoved the tape back into the drawer, slammed it shut, and fled the room. Back in the restoration hall, I forced myself to breathe. The rules weren't eccentricity. They were lifelines. Lights on. One painting at a time. Never acknowledge the draft. Never describe them aloud. Never touch. Leave at midnight. Every one of them had been written in blood and terror. As I locked the door at closing time, the silence of the hall followed me. And though I'd returned the logs and hidden the tape, one truth carved itself into my mind. This job wasn't about restoring paintings. It was about surviving them. The fourth night began the same as the others. Harrow greeted me briefly in the lobby, though his eyes lingered on me longer than before, as though he sensed the weight of what I had found. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer answers. But when he handed me the key, his fingers tightened around it. "Do not test them," he whispered. I nodded, though my heart still hammered with the memory of the logbooks and the tape. The restoration room felt different that night, not just oppressive, predatory. I kept the lights blazing. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and dust. Every canvas along the wall seemed to bulge faintly beneath its cover, as though the figures inside pressed closer, eager to be free. I tried to bury myself in work. A landscape this time, rolling hills, a faded river. Easy, harmless. But just after 10, the bulbs above me flickered. Once, twice, then all at once. Darkness swallowed the room. Rule 1. Never work with the lights off. My hands fumbled in panic, searching for the replacement bulbs. I had them ready, but the darkness pressed thick, smothering. I could see nothing, and then movement. Not from the corner of my eye. Straight ahead, the canvas in front of me shimmered faintly, its painted river rippling like real water. Shadows stirred beneath the surface, shapes that hadn't been there before. My breath caught. I forced my shaking hands to twist the bulb into place. The new light flared, spilling gold across the walls. The painting was still again, but not untouched. On the banks of the painted river, a new figure stood, tall, faceless, draped in black, its head tilted toward me. I remembered the rule: do not react. Record the change silently in the logbook. My hands trembled as I wrote, 10:14 p.m. New figure appeared in landscape. Faceless. Watching. But my pulse refused to steady, because I could swear the figure was closer now than it had been. The night dragged on. I forced myself to keep working, my eyes darting between bulb and brush, canvas and clock. But near 11, the temperature shifted. Not the draft this time, something heavier. A weight pressing against the walls, like the building itself was, being leaned on by unseen giants. Then came the sound, knocking not at midnight, early. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the restoration room door. My throat closed. Rule 7. At midnight, you must leave the restoration room. Lock the door behind you. If you hear knocking from inside after that point, ignore it. But this wasn't after midnight. This was now. I froze, brush in hand. The knocking came again, louder, heavier. I tried to focus on the canvas, but the sound dragged at me. Against every instinct, I turned toward the door and saw the handle twitch. Something was trying to come in. I stumbled back, knocking over the stool. My gloves slipped against the table edge, scattering brushes to the floor. The knocking grew frantic, pounding. The door rattled on its hinges. Not midnight, I whispered hoarsely. Not the rule, but maybe the rules were less fixed then, I thought. The bulbs above flared, then dimmed. My shadow stretched across the wall, thin and jagged. And then, from behind me, a whisper. Close, right at my ear, my name. I spun around. The covered canvases were shifting, their cloths trembling like something beneath them was struggling to emerge. One cloth slipped just enough to reveal an eye, painted but alive, wet, unblinking. It fixed on me, I clutched the folder of rules like a shield, my mind racing through every line. Do not uncover more than one. Do not describe aloud. Do not touch. But none of them told me how to survive this. The pounding at the door stopped. Instantly, the silence that followed was worse than the noise, and then footsteps. Inside the room, I knew I hadn't opened the door. Yet the sound was clear, deliberate, pacing across the floorboards toward me. I backed away until my shoulders hit the cold wall. The bulbs flickered again, and in that half-light, I saw it. One of the figures had stepped free. It wasn't smooth. It peeled itself from the canvas like skin tearing from flesh. Its painted body stretching into the room, dripping pigment like blood, its faceless head turned toward me. My body screamed to run, but the rules hammered through my mind. Do not react. Do not describe. Do not touch. I clamped my mouth shut, though bile burned my throat. My hands shook as I scribbled into the logbook. 11:27 p.m., figure exiting frame. The thing stood there, inches away, its head tilting as though curious. Then the bulbs blazed suddenly bright. The figure staggered, collapsing back toward its canvas like it had been yanked by invisible chains. When the light steadied, the painting was whole again. The river still, the hills empty, the figure gone. I collapsed into the chair, my chest heaving. For the next half hour, I didn't move, didn't breathe more than shallow sips. At midnight, I bolted from the room, locking the door with trembling hands. Harrow was waiting. This time, he didn't ask if I followed the rules. He looked at my face, pale and drenched in sweat, and simply said, "They noticed you." I couldn't speak. His eyes softened, just slightly. "You are still alive. That means they didn't take you yet." I left the building shaking, my body weak, my mind fractured. But one thought gnawed through the terror, sharper than any other. If one figure could step out when the lights failed, what would happen if more than one canvas was uncovered at once? The fifth night began with silence. When I arrived, the lobby was empty. No Harrow at the desk. No folded note waiting on the counter. Only the keys, lying bare on the polished wood, as if someone had left them in a hurry. I hesitated. Every other night, Harrow had been there stoic, watchful, the human barrier between me and the things in the frames. Without him, the building felt abandoned in a way I hadn't noticed before. Still, I needed the money. And more than that, I needed answers. I took the keys and climbed the stairs. The restoration room greeted me the same as always, too bright, too silent, too full of unseen eyes. I began my work, but my focus was gone. Every sound in the hall beyond made me twitch. Every flicker of the bulbs twisted my stomach. At 10, I heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, measured relief surged through me. Harrow must have arrived. Late. I unlocked the door and opened it, but the hall was empty. The footsteps continued anyway, echoing from nowhere. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, breath ragged. That was when I noticed the envelope on the desk. Heavy parchment, sealed, with wax. My name scrawled across the front. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. Hands shaking, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, written in Harrow's sharp hand. "They will not take you if you give them someone else." My stomach dropped. Beneath the note was a photograph. My own face, caught on grainy film as I worked in the restoration room. I nearly tore the paper in half. Was this some kind of threat? A warning? Or had Harrow been keeping records of me, the same way I had found records of those before me? Anger flared through the fear. For days, I had followed his rules. I had obeyed, endured, suffered the whispers, and the knocking. And all the while, he'd been documenting me. I shoved the envelope into my bag and tried to focus. But questions tore at me. How did he know the figures could be bargained with? Who had he given before? And more importantly, who would he give next? At 11, the bulbs flickered again. My body jolted with panic, but this time they steadied, before the dark could take hold. I exhaled shakily, then froze. A shadow stretched across the far wall. Not mine, not shaped like any canvas. Someone was in the hall. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the wood, breathing, slow, deliberate. I whispered, "Harrow." The breathing stopped. Then a voice, low and smooth. "You shouldn't have read them." Not Harrow's voice. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back as the handle rattled violently, then stilled. Silence. I didn't finish the shift. At midnight, I locked the door and fled, running down the stairs 2 at a time. The lobby lights were dim. The keys I'd taken earlier were gone from the counter. In their place was another envelope, smaller, already torn open. I unfolded the paper inside. Some of us survive longer because we learn not to keep all the rules. Some of us survive longest because we make sure others fail. No signature, but I didn't need one. Harrow hadn't abandoned me. He was setting me up. The betrayal stung sharper than the fear. All this time, I had believed the rules were ironclad lifelines. But now I understood they weren't only about the paintings. They were also about control. Harrow hadn't been protecting me. He'd been keeping me useful, expendable. That night, lying awake in my apartment, I couldn't escape the thought, if survival meant sacrifice, then how many people had Harrow already fed to the paintings? And how many more would he offer before they finally took him? The 6th night was different from the start. I almost didn't go back. My hands shook as I packed my gloves and brushes, every part of me screaming to run, to vanish, to let Harrow and his rules rot with the paintings. But curiosity chained me. I had seen too much, learned too much, and part of me wanted to confront him, to demand why he thought my life was his bargaining chip. So I returned. The lobby was deserted again. No Harrow, no note, only silence thick enough to smother me. I climbed. The stairs anyway, each step heavier than the last. When I opened the restoration room, something was wrong immediately. The cloths were gone. Every painting in the room was uncovered. Dozens of eyes stared out, unblinking, some soft with centuries of dust, others sharp and newly restored. A gallery of faces fixed on me, alive with quiet hunger. Rule 2, shattered, my knees nearly buckled. Someone had broken the rule before I arrived, and I knew who Harrow had left. Them bare, left them waiting. For me. I forced myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded as I crossed to the desk. The folder of rules lay open, one line underlined in red ink. At midnight, you must leave the restoration room. Lock the door behind you. But scrawled beneath, in fresh handwriting, was a new line, unless you are ready to end it. My mouth went dry. Harrow hadn't just abandoned me. He was testing me, or offering me up. The bulbs flickered overhead, dimming for a moment, then steadying. The figures in the frames seemed to twitch closer each time the light shifted, their painted forms warping. I clutched the logbook, my only shield of order, but it felt laughable now. Rules meant nothing if Harrow was rewriting them. I had 2 choices: obey the clock and flee, or stay and break the rules on my own terms. The knocking began early, again 11 sharp, this time from inside the room. One of the larger portraits trembled on its frame, the painted man's hands pressed flat against the inside of the canvas. His lips moved, though no sound emerged. The others stirred in sympathy, clothless, unbound. Their gazes followed me wherever I stepped. I backed against the door, chest heaving. Running felt impossible. If I left, Harrow would win. He would keep feeding them new assistants. The cycle would never stop. But staying might mean death. The clock ticked closer to midnight. Then I remembered something from the logs. One frantic entry. What if the knocking isn't them? What if it's the others? The others, survivors, trapped employees, or worse. I looked back at the trembling portrait. The painted man's lips still moved, against every instinct. I broke Rule 4. I whispered aloud what I saw. He's asking me to let him out. The air shifted instantly. The room groaned, heavy as if it recognized my voice. My skin burned cold. The man's mouth twisted into a grin. Not relief. Triumph. The knocking spread from frame to frame. A chorus of fists hammering against painted glass. The bulbs dimmed, straining against the weight of so many eyes. I had made my choice. Not to flee, not to obey, to fight. I lunged for the largest canvas, tearing the gloves from my hands. Rule 6 screamed in my mind. Never touch the surface with bare skin. But I ignored it. My fingers pressed against the cold, painted surface. It pulsed beneath me, wet, alive. The man inside grinned wider. His painted hands mirrored mine. For a heartbeat, I felt him pulling, dragging me inward. But I pushed harder. The canvas stretched like skin, warping under my weight. The frame splintered with a groan. The painted man's grin faltered. His eyes widened. I shoved again. The canvas ripped. A sound erupted from the painting, screams layered over screams. Voices centuries old, bursting like air from a tomb. The figures in the other frames convulsed, their eyes rolling back, their mouths open in silent fury. The bulbs blazed white. The room shook, then dashed silence. The canvas fell limp beneath my hand, its paint smeared, its figure gone, every other painting stilled, their gazes blank, empty. The clock struck midnight. I collapsed against the desk, trembling. My palm burned with raw blisters where the paint had touched me. But the room was quiet. For the first time, the silence felt empty. I had broken the rules, not by mistake, by choice. And somehow, I was still here. The next morning, I expected the police, or fire, or at the very least, Harrow waiting at my door with fury in his eyes. But nothing came. The world outside moved on, as if nothing had happened. People walked their dogs. Cars honked. The sun rose like always, and yet, my hand still ached. The burns from the canvas throbbed with each heartbeat. The skin cracked and raw. When I washed it, flecks of pigment came away, staining the water red and black. I couldn't stop thinking about the silence in that room after the canvas ripped. The way the figures vanished all at once. It hadn't felt like victory. It felt like a pause. By evening, I found myself walking back to the building. I told myself I just needed closure, to confront Harrow, demand answers, demand an end to the games. But when I arrived, the lobby was dark. The desk is empty. No Harrow, no keys. The front door wasn't even locked. My footsteps echoed too loudly. As I climbed the stairs, the air smelled of old wood and paint, sharp and sour at the restoration room. I hesitated. The door was ajar slowly. I pushed it open. The cloths were back. Every painting was neatly covered, like nothing had happened. The broken frame I had destroyed was whole again. The canvas smooth and untouched. My stomach turned to ice. On the desk lay the folder of rules, open, waiting, but it wasn't the same list. I picked it up with shaking hands. The handwriting was mine. Every line scrawled in my penmanship, every underline sharp and jagged, as if written in panic. And at the bottom, one final rule had been added: you must never leave. My breath caught. I dropped the folder and stumbled back, but the room seemed to tighten around me. The bulbs flared, the cloths shifted. One by one, the covered canvases began to stir, the fabric pressing outward as painted hands and faces pushed against it. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder. Racing toward midnight, though, it was nowhere near the hour. I backed against the door, but it wouldn't open. On the desk, the logbook flipped pages on its own, scribbles appearing in frantic strokes. He returned. He returned. He returned. Over and over, my vision blurred, my hand throbbed like fire, and then I realized the burns weren't burns. The paint was sinking deeper, seeping into my skin, crawling beneath it like veins. I looked down, in horror as my palm shimmered faintly, colors rippling under the flesh. Not burns, not wounds, a frame. The last thing I remember before the bulbs blew out was a voice, calm and familiar, echoing inside my skull. Harrow's voice. Good. You'll last longer than the others.